Hey fellow Earthlings, this is Lisa Camillo here, your friendly anthropologist and filmmaker. Welcome back to another episode where we dive into the big questions, the ones that make you wonder if our planet has just given up on us or if we still have a fighting chance. Today's guest is someone who's way smarter than me, and probably you too, when it comes to understanding planetary politics. So without further ado, let's talk about saving Earth from the clutches of garbage nationalism and the rise of fascist pricks. We've got Dr. Stefan Pedersen on the mic, a man who's not just sitting around complaining about how terrible everything is, like I do, but actually coming up with solutions that might just work. Stefan's snagged his PhD in political theory from the University of Leeds, even though he comes from the mighty Vikings. And now he's all about planetary politics. Yes, you heard that right, planetary. Because why stop at one's country when you can try to save the whole goddamn planet sci-fi style, right? He's a honorary research fellow at the University of Sussex and a research fellow with the Earth System Governance Project, where he is co-governor of the Task Force of Planetary Justice. If you're scratching your head, wondering what the hell all that means, don't worry, we're going to break it down. Think of him as the guy who's trying to get us all on the same page before Earth decides it's had enough of our nonsense. Now, I know what you're thinking. Didn't Trump already come up with a grand plan to save the planet by launching the United States Space Force? Yeah, well, Stefan's Planetary Federation is not like that, and is without the bizarre uniforms and the colossal waste of taxpayer money. This is a concrete idea, one that actually has a shot at making a difference. Stefan's here to tell us why we need a planetary federation to save the Earth. And trust me, it's not as sci-fi as it sounds. It's actually brilliant. He's also going to share his thoughts on how we can shut down populists like Meloni and Trump and get everyone to focus on something a little more important, like, the survival of the human race and the Earth species. So buckle up, because we're about to get into some heavy stuff, and you might just leave this episode feeling a little smarter, or at least a little bit less hopeless. Welcome, Stefan. How are you?
Hi. Oh, thanks. I'm good. It's a bit older here in the UK than it is in Italy, but not too much.
So the first question I always ask my guests is, how fucked are we in this world right now?
The answer to that, I think, is that unless we arrest and reverse climate change, and especially, carbon dioxide emissions and the heating that is happening, then we are fucked. But what I want to get into in this conversation is that I think I have the solution. It's a very comprehensive solution, and it is very difficult. But I think there's a window of opportunity still in the next few decades to actually solve things.
Yes, we have somebody with solutions. Amazing. Okay, we love that. Okay, everyone, today it's about positivity and how to move forward with this. So how to save ourselves. Tell us, Stefan. We're really, really keen to hear all about that.
Yeah. So in my work, I've been looking into how we have slowly been experiencing this worldview change or change in consciousness. So we have started to think about ourselves as inhabitants of the planet Earth instead of or separate countries and so forth. I mean, this is a very slow change, and you can see it happening essentially in real time from the 1960s onwards, but only in the most sort of creative and open-minded personalities. But moving forward, I think that this is something that is really, really starting to build momentum at the moment. And the younger generations are all educated to a wholly different degree because of all this interconnectedness, with the internet, and that we all share a sort of media culture that wasn't shared in the 60s or 70s or even 80s. And these things, I think, is a really sort of promising sign. But what's so confusing in my research is that why haven't anyone taken this starting point and followed the sort of logical political sequence that this is sort of indicating? And I think this is something that is partly due to a sort of lack of imagination on the part of people even on the political left. And it's also because of this sort of counter-evolution to the sort of planetary consciousness that was starting to emerge in the early 70s, where you have a sort of neoliberal or conservative backlash that not only makes it very difficult to think about the global solutions that are necessary in the world economy, but they have also appropriated the language of globality and universality and made it something that has been connected to neoliberal globalization and capitalism. So now universalism, which is a really core facet of the solution that I would advocate for, has been turned into something that for many people are just associated with neoliberal austerity, or what we could call it's like a class war, but with the elite making war on what used to be the middle class and what is becoming the precariat and so on and so forth.
So basically, they are making us fighting each other. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, or people are starting to think that the solution must be to go back to the nation state, back to nationalism, and then you separate your own economic sort of zone that you can be comfortable within and where you can have a welfare state. And for many people, that welfare state has to be like an ethno-welfare state. And that is very, very dangerous. But that is a reactionary regression when we really need to have a sort of innovative, progressive.
An evolution. Instead of evolving, we're devolving, seems like.
Yeah, exactly. But my main point isn't that we have this neoliberalism and that is problematic. But my key point is that we have this nationalism that even on the left
very dangerous
is seen as a sort of potential solution. So if you look at someone like Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn or maybe the new left coalition in France, the main solutions they are advocating deals with how to operate a national economy.
Okay.
I mean, they are international in many ways that are progressive, but they haven't taken that final leap to starting to think about life on the planet. They still have to work within this nation state confinement.
Because I'm a big Bernie Sanders fan. Huge. I love Bernie Sanders. Okay. I guess we can sort of criticize him on that.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with this. I mean, that's probably the only presidential candidate I've been enthusiastic about in my life.
Same.
But at the same time, I think he also represents an old left school of thinking that we need to move past if we want to have the comprehensive solutions that I want to lay out now.
Okay, very interesting. So this is the evolution of the left, basically, you're proposing, something even one step further.
Yeah, and it's not just the left, but it's also about the ecologism and green thought and so forth. Because I think the left is really about solidarity with the working class. That's its core sort of mission.
Yeah.
But with the green thinking, it's much more about not just nature, but keeping the whole biosphere alive.
Yeah.
And that is something that we actually have to decide if we want to do or not in the next couple of decades. And obviously not having the biosphere alive is suicide. So it's not really a choice we have. We just have to agree on it. Let's keep, human civilization functioning for another few hundred years at least, ideally.
Yeah.
I'd like to see like a 50,000 year run. That would be interesting to see where we get.
Absolutely. If we progress to be more in sync with nature, more in harmony with nature, yes, we can keep going.
Absolutely.
But if we keep killing and living the way we are, we deserve what's coming.
Yeah, absolutely. The challenge we have is in the long term to create a civilization that is symbiotic with the biosphere so that we can work to enhance it rather than to degrade it. And if we have enhanced it to the point where it's sort of self-sufficient, doesn't need sort of help by us any longer to function, then we can sort of just enjoy ourselves, I think, and just find some kind of conservative politics that it actually would be good politics because we reach some kind of utopian level. But I don't think we'll be able to reach that point in the next sort of 700 years because we have messed up the Earth system to such a degree that we actually have to make a conscious effort as a world civilization to keep things from actually collapsing.
It'll be a lot of work.
Yeah, it's not about saving humanity necessarily, but it's about making civilization sort of not implode to a degree where it destroys the biosphere. We have to have a sort of managed decline on some level. And to reach that, we essentially have to, once we have gone through this profound worldview shift, where we realize that we are first and foremost Earthlings and not just Italian or Norwegian or whatnot, then we can like create a sort of politics of planet-wide solidarity with nature, with the biosphere, but also with people. Because if people aren't allowed to live at a certain standard of living, then they become a problem, not just for the biosphere, but for the rest of humanity. Because there's no way of living in a sort of symbiotic relationship with nature if you have to chop down a tree every day to sort of make sure that you keep yourself warm and it's
Comfortable.
exactly. So we have to share the wealth essentially,
Yeah, I agree.
because there's certain areas that are really good at producing maybe tomatoes. Other areas are excellent at getting fish. I mean, if you look back at how things worked just a century ago, we had this arrangement where people in Norway would make potatoes and fish, and people in further south in Europe would
Yeah.
produce wheat and grain and so forth. And this kind of stuff is what we have to get back to, but in a sort of managed way.
Yeah.
It's not about world trade. It's about essentially making sure that we're able to produce food for the world population, but in a way that minimizes the impact this makes on the rest of the biosphere.
Yeah. Keep food for the animals themselves. Because, for example, the polar bears in Antarctica are getting closer and closer to humans, so they can actually scavenge food from the garbage cans because they can't find food for themselves anymore because it's been fished out. Can you imagine now? It's July. This is probably going to be launched, this episode a bit later on. But now we are in the middle of July and we already terminated the fish population that we could actually fish out from the Mediterranean. So we now have to import fish from other seas because we fished out already. It's insane.
Yeah, I mean, we're living beyond our means. That's definitely clear. But the thing that's sort of relevant to my argument is that we've been aware of this for at least
Yeah.
50 years, because in the early 1970s, these things were becoming clear as day. And there was a conversation about it where The Limits to Growth is maybe the most iconic book here. But we had other books where the political implications were laid out in greater detail and so forth. Basically, what happened at that time is that we found a solution, but it's too radical to make any impact on the actual real world politics, because world politics were overdetermined by the superpower competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, communism versus capitalism, or democracy versus autocracy, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But because this neoliberal counter-revolution happened in the late 70s and early 80s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the solution that was sort of implemented from the West in that moment in time was to turn the ex-Soviet Union into a free market. That's how you encourage this oligarchy that happened with all the
Yeah.
billionaires basically getting the state assets from the Soviet Union and turning those into private corporations.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the whole sort of moment that came in 1989, 1991, where we could have changed world civilization into something much more ecologically feasible, was lost because we were on this upward trajectory with neoliberalism becoming the sort of common sense in world politics. But now I think we are seeing that there's a popular sort of rejection of neoliberalism, which unfortunately has led to this nationalist populism to a certain extent. But there's also a sort of left reawakening, I think, happening at the same time, where we are starting to talk about sort of ecological and socialist solution in combination, that I think is really promising.
Okay, that's good.
But the problem within that space at the moment is that this is still happening with like green national parties and socialist parties in this national nation state context. So what we're really missing is like a global movement that has this sort of organizational power to essentially affect a program of planet-wide change that would change world politics. And the way to achieve that is to have a sort of clear vision of where we want to go. And that clear vision needs to be, how can we organize at a planetary scale in ways that will not promote, overt centralization that will not promote all dictatorship, but creates the space for local autonomy, but simultaneously where you have a sort of overarching organization.
So something like the UN. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, but it has to be something completely different from the UN. What's good about the UN and extends it. So instead of having major powers with veto powers, you need some kind of organization that is essentially designed to promote planetary solutions, but to do this in a way that also doesn't create a popular backlash. So it has to be democratically legitimate. But that should happen through a sort of planet-wide party politics instead of having national representatives. It's not just neoliberalism that's the problem, but it's the nationalism in the state system. And this nationalism is sort of perpetuated by constantly giving nation states the power to say what's what.
So it's so everybody's representing their own interests. That's the problem.
Yeah, the problem is that people think in the national interest, but we have to design an institution at a sort of overarching planetary institution that can act in the planetary interest. Make sure that human civilization stays within these planetary boundaries, for instance, that have been identified by these Earth system scientists.
And so is this somebody already starting this process? Are you guys looking into this? Or you already started? Where is the process at? Because it sounds amazing.
Yeah, this is sort of on the theoretical drawing board. But what is interesting is that we are seeing a lot of people starting to work towards this in different ways. So, for instance, there's a book that just came out by two guys writing for the Berggruen Institute, which is an institute based in Los Angeles that is sponsored by a billionaire, Nicholas Berggruen, I think is his name. But anyways, for being a think tank, this is one of the most progressive ones. And they are starting to talk about how we can create a system of planetary subsidiarity, which is very interesting concept because it rejects that notion of having a world state and wants to have a sort of localized system, which would still function as a sort of global whole together. And I've written about the possibility of having a sort of planetary federalism, where you have the main units, instead of them being nation states, that would be regions. So instead of having Germany represented, you would have Bavaria represented as just one part of that larger area. And then, of course, in blanking on what you call the different regions in Italy.
I guess Sardinia, for example.
Yeah. So Sardinia and Sicily, they would be, separate entities within this, and they could defend their local interests at the planetary level.
Yeah, that makes more sense. Yeah, definitely.
And in the same manner, you would, instead of having Washington, D.C. representing the US or Beijing representing China, you would have all these smaller regions. So you don't get these domineering actors.
Yeah, okay, cool, interesting.
So you get rid of this superpower or great power problem.
Yeah.
And and even though there are regions which are, tiny, like Iceland or Vanuatu, and regions that are huge, like, metropolitan Tokyo or Mexico City and so forth.
How would you do that representation-wise?
Yeah. I mean, one way of dealing with that would, of course, be to have boroughs represented. So you don't have New York represented.
You have what?
Boroughs, like parts of the city, municipalities. So instead of having New York City, you could have Brooklyn or Queens.
Oh, okay.
But I'm interested in how can we have a representation in the planetary institutions that doesn't reinforce nationalism? Because nationalism and neoliberalism are two of the sort of stumbling blocks for having a functioning planet polity.
And you wouldn't have voting? Or would you have voting like the UN that has the veto?
I think having a veto is exactly what you want to get away from, because you've seen how that works in the Security Council. And every time there is something important that needs to be decided, you either have the US blocking it or you have China, Russia blocking it.
What's the difference between veto and voting?
Yeah, a veto means that you have the right to decide that this suggestion or this motion does not go forward.
Like the US. The US can block stuff.
Yeah, you can block a resolution in the security. The recent example of this is, of course, how the US has consistently blocked any attempt to hold Netanyahu's government in Israel to account.
Yeah, absolutely. Terrible.
But in the system I'm talking about, where you would sort of get rid of this like great power politics, you could have regions representing their regional interest at the
Uh-huh.
planetary level. But to make sure that you have a planetary politics, you also would have democratic parties, like political parties, but that were representing the planetary interests from certain ideological standpoints. So you could have a planetary party that wants to protect human rights. You could have a planetary party that wants to protect the environment at any cost. And you could have a planetary party that wants to have economic equality. And if you have these three different viewpoints represented as planetary parties, then they could reach compromises where you sort of, what's the best we can do, where you keep human rights in mind, the need for greater economic equality in mind, but also maintain the habitability of the planet. So that would be a sort of ideal scenario. But in a real world, planetary institutions, there would, of course, be someone that wanted to make sure the capitalist system was up and running within the parameters that sustainability would allow for. So this like green modernism or a green capitalism that have been sort of dominant in the last few decades.
Yeah, this fake shit, as I call it.
That could possibly function in this kind of environment as well. But it would be, of course, a sort of regressive force within it. But the whole point is to get rid of this nationalist default that we go back to constantly in national politics and in international politics, where you have intergovernmental organizations where nation states are represented at the global level. And they've tried to protect their own national interest instead of protecting the global environment. And if no one protects the global environment, we are fucked. So part of the solution would be to get rid of that national interest as a sort of overpowering element in politics.
I love that. It's great.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
great. In theory, though, but I don't know how much is plausible, though. I don't know if it's very utopistic knowing the nature of humans and the government we have right now. Come on, we're about to elect Trump. After the shooting yesterday, it happened yesterday, everybody's still talking about that. So we're probably going to have for sure a seat for him as a second-term president. Come on. How can we possibly manage this amazing idea?
I think what is happening right now is that we are starting to see a nationalism that is becoming very, very obvious for people.
It's toxic.
Yes, but it's becoming very clear that this can't go on.
No, absolutely.
The one good thing with people like Trump and Meloni and Farage and these nationalist populists is that they are essentially forcing the population to see what a naked sort of nationalism looks like.
Yeah,
And that makes it harder for people like Biden or Keir Starmer, Macron, and so on to keep using nationalism as something that's meant to be positive. I mean, at some point, people will have to see through this, that nationalism, even if it's done by centrist politicians, they are handing the sort of political debates over to people like Trump and Meloni because they refuse to engage with politics at the planetary level. They only want to keep things within this national space. And once you confine politics to a national space, it's the people that are the most nationalists that will have the best argument within that logic, because they want to really want to defend the nation, impurities and immigrants.
So that's an easy win.
Exactly. But if we could switch the conversation to be about how can we ensure that the Earth system doesn't, implode on us and we just kill ourselves, then we should be talking about how can we organize at a planetary level in ways that makes it possible for people to live healthy, dignified lives that are interesting and fun, but that doesn't destroy the atmosphere and doesn't destroy the biosphere. So it's all about, we have to start thinking that we are one species that is packed with idiots. But at the same time, there's enough reasonable and smart people that maybe they could take charge for once.
Yeah.
But I mean, the challenge is for people to sort of agree on a comprehensive plan that would have elements of what I've been talking about. Instead of seeing it as utopian, you have to see that it is like, if we do A, B, and C, we'll get much closer to where we're going to be than if we don't do A, B, and C.
Yeah. It's funny because I was talking to a famous astronomer that will be on this podcast soon. And he was saying he believes, for example, that the only way to unite everyone is to have an alien invasion or being visited from outer space, because then everybody will understand that we are all from one planet and not from different nations. So he was against this nationalism as well. That's very toxic. I guess it's a similar concept that we need to unite as one and understand that we're all in one planet. And if it's a very fragile planet as well, or we made it fragile.
I don't think we really need aliens to do this. I think we just need to think about what's happened in the past. I mean, we're both Europeans, so we have, I guess, a closer connection to World War II than most Americans, for instance. And we know that there is, the history of fascism and Nazism. That is something that is sort of tangible to people, at least in my generation still, because my grandparents experienced the war and they could tell the horrific stories and so on. And that makes me think that the sort of what we definitely don't want to be is Nazis or fascists. And what did the Nazis and fascists do? Yeah, they took the national interest to an extreme, and they were, proponents of nationalism. It's different from what we see today, but it's so much commonality as well that it's incredible that we haven't seen a progressive politics develop that sort of rejects the nation state and starts thinking about how can we form a planet-wide community where we can, live together in a more cooperative atmosphere, where we share at least some basic goals that should be enshrined in a constitution for the planet, which is, if there's a question of profitability versus habitability, we should always come down on habitability.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so what would the first steps be? Where would we start? I love that. Let's start.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think we're starting to see them coming now, the manifestos of planetary politics. There was one published 5 years ago by Lorenzo Marsilli, I think, another Italian, working with the Berggruen Institute. And then you have the planet politics being developed by people like Anthony Burke working in Australia, where they really emphasize the need for having a sort of multi-species politics, where we think of ourselves not as human beings alone, but as part of a multi-species web of life, where we have to take care of the habitats of other creatures, because we are ourselves also sort of multi-species beings. I mean, the microbes in our guts are not human beings. They are different sorts of bacteria and so forth. And the environment where you are sitting right now wouldn't function without the cicadas we can hear in the background, possibly.
Sorry.
We have to start thinking of ourselves as parts of this multi-species web of life. And this doesn't end at the border of one nation, starts in another. I mean, if you start unraveling it anywhere, you create a hole in it. And that's just diminishing the biosphere.
Yeah, well, nature doesn't have boundaries. It's not that you have like bees from Germany.
Exactly. And we could see this with things like, the pandemic and so forth is another way of thinking of ourselves as these planetary creatures, because if there's a virus that doesn't matter where it starts, it ends up going across the planet in 3 weeks or whatever for that to spread.
Yeah, true.
So all of this sort of indicates that we need planetary solutions for planetary challenges. And to get those solutions, we need to think about the planetary interest and the multi-species interest, not the national interest.
Absolutely.
But at the same time that I'm saying this, it should also be obvious that the national interest of every country coincides with the planetary interest. If you want to think a bit further ahead than 5 years, if you think 50 years ahead or 100 years ahead, the national interest and the planetary interest are exactly the same, I think. But it doesn't make sense to compartmentalize it into nations for much longer.
No, absolutely. I don't think it would ever work, because if we are nature and if we apply concepts that in nature do not exist, it would clash, right? if we put these laws and these regulations and the interests of one instead of the multitude of an ecosystem, it would just not work because we are part of nature and it doesn't make sense. It's not a normal law, right?
No, I think the only laws that we should be, abiding is that you basically don't mess with nature. You can take out exactly what we need to have good lives, I think. But there's so much exploitation going on and diminishing of nature that isn't sustainable. So at some point, we'll need to reach some kind of agreement that if you want timber for your house, we just have to make sure that no one gets more of that than what the planet could reproduce in that same year. We have to start learning how much exactly it is we can take out. And then take maybe half of that just to make sure, because there's all these, feedback loops and potential for, black swan events and so forth. So what we're seeing now with all these forest fires, for instance, is that if we wanted to emit just enough carbon dioxide to make sure that the planet doesn't heat it any longer, that limit that we could maybe figure out would have to be something like 50% of the actual limit, because we need to leave space for nature actually having its own carbon dioxide emissions and so forth that we can't really control.
That's fair. Yeah, I agree. Interesting. Okay, so the first step is to convince people, to let everybody know about this proposal, right? To have this federation. So getting the word out and I guess press governments to be part of this initiative.
Well, you don't press governments to be part of it. You elect new governments.
Yes, absolutely.
Because I think the current elites, they are corrupt and they are, I would say, they're beyond salvaging because they are essentially protecting the status quo. But it only takes an election to make a new government appear. But obviously, the first step before you can get to that is to have political parties and political movements and social movements and so forth that agree that there is a sort of program that we should follow that isn't just about creating a sort of anarchist utopia within the city, but it's also about having a planet-wide structure that can take care of the planetary challenges and so forth. Because what I see, especially with students, is that there's this sort of ethical urge to be completely autonomous. That I think is very appealing to a certain point. But when we start talking about planetary challenges and how can we sort of diminish the impact of the technosphere on the biosphere, then that has to go beyond just like local action and operating at a sort of autonomous scale. We have to have some kind of planet-wide organization and sort of institutions that can handle at least this sort of shift towards a more locally autonomous society. You can't just replace the nation states with local autonomy. The nation state has to sort of wither away because there's planetary institutions that take care of the really hard stuff, and there's local autonomy that takes care of the local problems. And then eventually the nation state might just stop having a sort of positive function. But this is sort of long-term thinking.
Yeah. Are there already politicians that are campaigning over this issue, that embrace this philosophy and this potential new organization?
If I know any politicians,
they would like to have this global federation.
I'm not sure if they exist, to be honest.
We should start. I'll start.
I think there's so much skepticism about globalization because of the neoliberal connotations. So I think we have to completely change the vocabulary we're using. We have to talk about the planetary solutions instead of global solutions. And we have to emphasize the ecological aspect. It's not about homogenizing culture. It's about preserving life and diversity and so forth. So it's all these like really difficult and sort of contradictory things has to be taken into account, because there's so much sort of caricature of thinking about planetary solutions. And even if you just use the word planetary, people sort of flinch because they think that this is about world domination, but it's really about ending the domination of humanity over nature. It's about ending the domination of major powers over the rest of humanity. It's about ending the domination of capitalism over the lives of humans and so on. So it's a sort of emancipatory project, but emancipatory in a sort of biospheric politics, multi-species context.
I think sounds very futuristic. It sounds very sci-fi. I love that. It's like very, let's see, Planetary Federation.
Yeah.
I'm watching actually Foundations right now. The one from Isaac Asimov.
Yeah.
And so I'm a big fan, such a nerd. Now I'm showing my nerd side. But I love that. They have like Federation of Planets. And, I love that. I think it's great. Let's start a party.
Yeah, I think that is parts of that aspect could be pretty interesting for people, I think. And I think it could be very interesting for people that are attracted to politics and universities and stuff like that to be part of a sort of planetary, I guess, strata of humanity that could forge these solutions and so forth. I'm not going to say that they would necessarily be that we need that elite. I think we need to have everyone on board, but as a sort of agent to create awareness of it, I'm thinking that this could be university educated people that are interested in nature and being nice to people.
It's not that hard, people. Come on, really.
Yeah.
It's pretty basic.
Yeah.
Let's not die. That's all. That's all we're asking.
Exactly. But at the same time, you have to sort of come to grips with the fact that to get from a world that is dominated by nation states and capitalism, you have to engage with the people that are in power, and they're not going to let go easily. So it's all about forging a sort of multi-species, multi-class coalition, I think.
Stefan, I can see Bernie Sanders embracing this. I really think he would be like, you know what? This sounds amazing. These little mittens. Well, thank you so much, Stefan. It's been really enlightening and very different. I never heard of this, never thought about it, but I like it. I actually really do. I think it has the potential, if everybody would listen and understand the concept. That's what we need, actually, in order to survive.
But I think this is something that people have been talking about for a long time, and it's all about having the argument come from a lot of different people, and hopefully that will get us closer to something that could appeal to people more broadly eventually.
I really hope so. Well, thank you so much again, and let's be in touch and let's see where this goes.
Great meeting you.
All right, guys, that's a wrap on this episode. Big thanks to Dr. Stefan Pedersen for coming on and making us all feel a bit better, or at least less doomed, about the state of the world. Remember, while some people are out there trying to build space armies or colonizing Mars, Stefan's out here pitching something way more useful, a planetary federation that could actually help us avoid turning Earth into a glorified wasteland. If you want to keep up with Stefan's work or just want to see some more brilliant takes on how to fix the mess we're in, give him a follow on X, formerly known as Twitter, at EarthCiv, C-I-V. Trust me, it's way better than doom scrolling through your feed and reading Elon Musk's deranged tweets. And hey, while you're online, don't forget to check out our website, againstthetightfilms.com, to learn more about the chaos we're stirring up behind the scenes. This podcast is produced by Against the Tide Films, where we're all about shaking things up, one episode at a time. If you'd like to contribute and buy us a coffee so we keep this podcast going, make us a donation or buy one of our t-shirts. Now, if you like this episode, go ahead and subscribe, rate it, and make sure to set a reminder to tune in every Wednesday. Seriously, hit that little bell or whatever that is. Don't miss it. You can catch us on your favorite podcast platforms, whether you're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. And before you go, maybe consider what your role could be in this planetary federation Stefan's talking about. I mean, you got to admit, it sounds a hell of a lot cooler than going to a red planet where everything can kill you, even the air. So let's save this planet, not abandon it, right? This is Lisa Camillo signing off. Stay curious, stay defiant, and remember, the Earth isn't just some background scenery in your selfies. It's the only home we got. So let's treat it that way, shall we? Catch you next week.